In a classic cognitive study by Chi, Feltovich, and Glaser, two groups of subjects sat down to examine identical physics problems. The data presented was exactly the same. The realities they inhabited were completely different. Novices looked at the page and isolated literal physical objects, ropes, blocks, and pulleys. But experts perceived the invisible physical laws, mapping force vectors, angles, and loops of energy transfer. The study revealed a strict divide in categorization. Novices sorted the worksheets into piles of pulley or incline problems. The experts sorted those identical sheets by the underlying principles, like conservation of energy. Expertise, therefore, does not correlate with sharper eyesight or a larger capacity for memorizing facts. It is a shift in what the human mind chooses to categorize first. When a learner expresses confusion, the standard professional reflex is to provide more information. We add longer explanations, an extra slide deck, or a denser list of facts, assuming volume cures lack of comprehension. The evidence suggests otherwise. Real understanding requires what researchers call compression with fidelity. This is a mechanical process. It involves taking massive amounts of surface detail and reducing them into a smaller, highly organized structural model. The strict requirement is that the smaller model must preserve enough causal power to accurately predict outcomes. If the reduction loses predictive power, it is a simplification, not compression. Acquiring mastery is ruthless reduction. Experts don't hold thousands of facts in their working memory. They hold a tight structural organization that generates answers on demand. To test whether expert memory relies on raw brain capacity or structural compression, researchers turn to the domain of competitive chess. This diagram demonstrates the control condition of the experiment. Subjects were asked to memorize a chessboard where the pieces were scattered randomly, ignoring all rules of the game. The data showed that in these random arrangements, chess grandmasters performed exactly the same as complete novices. Their supposed memory advantage dropped to 0. The parameters were then shifted to a test condition representing a logical mid-game arrangement. Faced with a valid layout, expert recall skyrocketed. They vastly outperformed the novices, instantly reproducing the board from memory. This disparity exists because of chunking. The experts were not memorizing individual wooden pieces on squares. They perceived meaningful configurations and operational schemas. Human working memory capacity is strictly limited. According to Feldman's review of concept learning, shorter, compressed rules are inherently easier for the brain to process than tangled, exception-heavy rules. Cognitive advantages manifest only when a learner possesses a schema to group the incoming data. Without an underlying structure, the brain simply cannot retain dense information. To map exactly what the expert brain is attempting to compress, we can use the visual metaphor of costumes versus bones. Costumes are the distracting surface features. They are the specific environmental variables, the physical shapes, and the literal objects present in an isolated case. Bones are the invariant structures. They are the mechanisms and limits that dictate how a system operates, regardless of what the exterior happens to look like. When a learner fails to grasp a concept, it rarely means they need to see more costumes. It means they cannot locate the bones. Subject matter experts are uniquely capable of consistently finding these deep structural bones across wildly diverse and novel scenarios. The transition from novice to expert is defined by this specific cognitive shift. It is the moment someone stops cataloging objects and begins mapping structures. This layout represents the 5 specific analytical questions experts subconsciously ask to replace endless lists of raw data with compressed schemas. First, they identify the causal outcome. They determine exactly what action produces what result. Second, they pinpoint the precise mechanism. They locate the process through which that outcome occurs. Third, they locate the constraints. They look for the limits on the system's performance or possibilities. Fourth, they map the relational dependency. They establish how individual parts rely on one another to function. Fifth, they isolate the invariants. They identify the exact principles that remain true even as the variables change. These 5 questions act as an aggressive filter. They systematically strip away irrelevant data and surface exceptions. Without this active filtering, working memory becomes overwhelmed by surface-level anomalies and isolated facts. Habitually applying this rigorous protocol is the exact mechanism that converts overwhelming noise into a single high-fidelity schema. The primary challenge for educators and system designers is figuring out how to force a learner's brain to abstract these underlying structures. This flowchart illustrates the main failure mode of teaching using a single example. Presenting one isolated case results in the learner perfectly imitating the surface steps without understanding the mechanism. The empirical solution is schema induction, achieved through the presentation of multiple contrasting cases. Comparing 2 to 3 examples that look completely different on the surface but share the exact same deep structure forces the brain to abstract the core rule connecting them. We measure the success of this abstraction through transfer. Transfer is the ability to apply the extracted schema to an entirely novel surface case, making it the ultimate test of understanding. If a learner can flawlessly repeat 10 disconnected facts from a textbook but cannot transfer the logic to a new scenario, structural compression has failed. Translating this cognitive theory into practical application requires specific operational changes for engineers and instructional designers. The first directive is to abolish costume questions in training environments. Replace them exclusively with structure questions. Ask learners to identify the mechanism or the constraint, not the surface object. The second directive is to mandate the use of contrasting cases in all onboarding materials. Presenting varying surface examples simultaneously artificially forces schema induction early in the learning process. The third directive is to redesign all testing protocols. Permanently abandon rote repetition tests and measure only the successful transfer of logic to novel, unseen cases. Implementing these 3 steps systematically dismantles the illusion of competence. It forces learners out of passive memorization and builds genuine generative capacity. Adding more disconnected facts to a system creates cognitive drag. It does not produce mastery. The highly trained expert mind is collapsed and efficient. They reduce massive, chaotic datasets into sharp, predictive models, requiring far less energy to wield. You understand something when you can carry reality as a smaller structure without losing its causal power. The ultimate goal of learning, training, and system design is to eliminate the noise, hunt for the invariants, and achieve compression with fidelity.